You know, I heard Earl speak this morning, and he gave me a good insight. I'm to speak on patriotic Christians versus Christian patriots. But Earl brought up something that it really hit home with me. He says there are some people who believe in God, and there's some people who believe God. And there's a lot of difference between a person who believes in God and one who believes God. Now, usually I title my talks on whatever subject I deal in. Sometimes I'm dealing in economics, sometimes in sorcery, sometimes in law. I usually title it, based on Matthew 10:16, how sheep can survive in wolf country, because there are many areas that the wolves are operating under, and we need to know how to survive in all of these areas. So I guess today it'll probably be pretty largely the area of law that I was speaking in, and but the point is that in any of these groups you find quite a variety of people. Now, the title, the distinction between patriotic Christians and Christian patriots, is quite important. You see, where is the noun? Is the noun Christian or is the noun patriot? You see, a Christian patriot, he's primarily a patriot, and he uses Christianity as a prop. Now, I had an experience of going into a court with a fellow one time. I was writing a lot of his briefs and one thing and another, and then in going into court, I know the fellow, he had a Bible in his home, but had never used it. But he says, "Do you think I ought to take that in court with me?" And he could set it on the defense stand on the table, so the judge and different ones, the jury, would think he was a Christian. Well, you see, in that case, he was a patriot. He wanted to fight the Internal Revenue Service and what he thought was unjust laws and everything, but Christianity was a prop. And and he would try to impress people that he was a Christian. And, well, that doesn't work very well. You're not going to have God's blessing when you do that kind of thing. There's only one way that you can do it, and that is you're a patriot because you're a Christian. That would be a patriotic Christian. Christian is the noun, patriotism is the adjective. And with that view, you can then accept the promises of Romans 8:28. That has been I've lived a good many years. I'm 73, and I have claimed that promise so many times in my life it would be hard to state. I couldn't even remember all of them. I do it sometimes 3 times a day. Even on the way to the camp here, I had a wheel bearing go out of my car, and I claim Romans 8:28 there. Well, what does Romans 8:28 say? It says, "All things work together for good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose." Now, I think that was written primarily, that promise is to the few who find a narrow way into the kingdom of heaven. God said, or Christ said, the many are on the wide road to destruction. Few there will be who will find the narrow way into the kingdom of heaven. Well, I think it was the few who are on that narrow road into the kingdom of heaven that Romans 8:28 is addressed to. And it says all things. Now, even a wheel bearing going out of a car. Well, in January, I had 2 special agents of the Internal Revenue Service, 7 o'clock in the morning. They came up and they flashed their badge and they said, "Are you Mr. Freeman?" I says, "Yes, I'm Mr. Freeman." They said, "We would like to read you your rights." And, well, I had no idea what they had in mind. but they are two Christian Israelite men. They were about 25 years old, nice-looking fellows and everything. We shouldn't be afraid of our fellow Israelites because we know behind them the real evil is the one that's hiring them. They're just working for a salary, and most of them don't know what they're doing. I just say pity them, for they know not what they do. That's really the attitude to take for them. Just pity them, that's all. And so they came up and they said, we'd like you to read your rights. I says, well, come on in. There's no sense in standing on the porch. Sit down. And when they came in, I says to my wife, get them a cup of coffee. And so they sat down and they read me my rights. And about that time, my wife came in with 2 cups of coffee, and she was shaking so much they had most of it in the saucer. But anyway, I says, well, my wife put a little of that coffee in your saucer so it'll be cooler when you drink it. It's all saucered for you. And I says, well, now, what is the problem? They had read me my rights. And he said, well, it seems you're charged with trying to defeat the government in the collection of taxes. And I says, well, that's a surprise. I says, how do you come about that? I do speak on the truth, but how would that defeat the government in the collection of lawful taxes? And they said, well, to make a long story short, did you ever speak in Salt Lake City? And I said, oh, I spoke in Salt Lake City many times. And they said, did you ever speak to patriotic groups there? I says, that's the only, it'll either be a Christian group or a patriotic group. That's the only groups I ever speak to. And they said, well, did you speak in Salt Lake on the 7th of February, 1984? And I reached in my pocket, I have diaries. I can tell you every place I did, everything I've done since 1941. And so I walked over and right near my desk, and I pulled out 1984 and opened the diary. I said, what month do you want? February 7th. I opened it up, February 7th. No, I was in Colorado Springs. I handed it to them to read. And the 2 of them read it, and they said, well, this doesn't look like you're the person we're after. You're charged with having spoken in Salt Lake on that date and advised people not to file income taxes. Well, I says, I never have advised people not to file income taxes, and you can see I was not in Salt Lake on that date. And they said, that settles it. And they were ready to go. They said, you'll hear no more from it. And I said, well, here you came all the way up from Denver. Why leave so soon? Why don't you sit down a while and let me tell you what I do tell in these, so that sometime. So I talked to them for 3 hours, and they didn't notice it till I looked at the clock. And so I told my wife, maybe you ought to get these fellas something to eat. And then they said, oh, is it that late? Oh, we got to get back to Denver. We can't, but this is one of the most enjoyable mornings we put in. And we'd love to have you speak down in to the IRS in Denver. I says, anytime you can arrange it, I'll be glad to do it. And then when they were going out, I said, well, if you ever come this way again, even if you pass through, stop in and visit. They said, we certainly will. So now, you see, these fellows are fellow Israelites. They don't know what they're doing. They just got a job, and it pays them good. And so they go on the basis of the information they had. Well, now, I can show you right where Romans 8:28 worked in that one. I didn't know what they were after. And the point is that I just took that at God's word, that all things, even these IRS agents, special agents, armed and everything else, that all things work together for good. Well, it just happened that my diary showed I hadn't spoken in Salt Lake on the day in question. But you see, it's I just gave him the truth. I didn't try to hold anything. Now, you see, the difference is a patriotic Christian, he wouldn't have had Romans 8:28 to rely on. So then he would have relied on the latest information he got from the Patriotic network, and the minute the IRS agents came up in front of him, he'd say, I claim my rights, all my rights. You're bring up a warrant and all this stuff, and they'd made a big fuss out there and put those fellows on the defensive. And so you just, as long as you're dealing with Israelites, now I wouldn't say that if you got a couple of sharp-nosed Edomites there, that you would follow the same procedures. You would still claim Romans 8:28, but I wouldn't invite them into my house. I'd deal with them on the front porch. But when I saw I had some good, clean-cut Israelite fellows, they were nice-looking fellows, and I felt, gosh, they can't be my enemy. So bring them right in. And I answered every question truthfully, and luckily I kept a diary, and that settled that situation. Because in truth, I couldn't remember whether I had been in Salt Lake on the 7th of February or not, and I might have got into a jam if my diary had said I was there. But then I would still have a way out, because I would just say what I really said. I believe what actually happened is a fellow who calls himself Freeman, John Law Freeman. That's not what his real name is, but he changed his name to Freeman, and I believe he was probably the one that spoke there, and they had agents there apparently that had got some of his talk, and then later somebody said, well, it was a fellow by the name of Freeman spoke there, and then somebody else said, well, that must be Howard Freeman over in Lusk. So that's how they got me in on the thing. But anyway, things work out pretty good, and I'll show you how it'll work out in most cases. Now, I want to get as much information to you as I can in the time that I have available. I have worked out a technique by using the Sixth Amendment in which I don't care what agency of government comes after you, that you can defend yourself in a way that they will run from you. As James says, resist Satan and he'll flee from you. Well, actually, they'll actually flee from you. They don't want to see you that close. Now, one of the important things I'm going to start off with, in any court action that you have, you want to have a court reporter that you can trust. And I'll try to hurry through it. Just before I left for a trip east, I made a 7,800-mile trip to the east, and then I only had about 3 days home, and I came down here. But just before I left there was a fellow running an insurance business in Boston. He called me up. He says, you never heard of me. He says, I just came on to one of the tape of a talk you gave in Providence a couple of years ago. And he says, I had a situation where I thought I was going to use it. But he says, I think you'd be interested in the way the situation worked out. He says, the situation is this. He says, I'm a real estate salesman, and he says, I had a customer that was interested in buying a shopping center. Well, he says, when you get a customer who will buy a shopping center, there's a good commission in there. And he says, so you don't fail to keep your appointments with a fellow like that. But he says, my appointment was at Plymouth, Massachusetts, about 40 miles out of Boston, at 11 o'clock in the morning. And he says, gosh, I don't need 3 hours to get to Plymouth. So he says, I figured I could go into the office, get a little work done, then I'd go to Plymouth. Well, he says, I got the office, and one thing after another tied me down. And he says, I looked at my watch. He says, I had 40 minutes to get 40 miles to meet this important customer in Plymouth. And he says, I've got, I don't know, 7 or 8 traffic lights to go through before I get on the open highway, and another 3 till I get to the hotel. So he says, that meant that when I got on the open highway, I had to do better than 60. He says, well, that's no problem with my car. I got a new one, and it'll move right along the highway. But he says, the trouble is, when I got going down the highway, next thing I looked in my mirror, and here's the flashing lights. And he says, the trooper came up, and he says, I told him, get me to a telephone as quick as you can. I'll do anything you want after that, but just get me to a telephone. Well, he says he tagged me for driving 94 miles an hour. So he must have figured I had an important occasion, so no problem at all. He says, follow me, and he got me to a telephone. He says, I called up my customer, told him I'd be a half hour late to wait, and he said, okay. So then I took my ticket and went on, and he says, I sold the property. Well, he says, then it came the problem, what am I going to do with this ticket? This is my 3rd speeding offense in Massachusetts. And he says, that means I lose my driver's license, in addition, a stiff fine. And he says, when your 3rd speeding offense is 94 miles an hour, he says, that's a tough one to kind of beat. And so he says, I had that information of yours, and he thought, this is a chance, I've got to try it. So he says, the one thing that worried me, he says, you mentioned get a responsible court reporter. Don't use a tape recorder because they can doctor tape recorders. Well, he says, these county courts, the judges all very often share the office with the court reporter. And so the court reporter owes his job to the judge. So if the judge should happen to make a mistake and get something in the record that he didn't want, he could very easily influence that court reporter to take that out of the record. So he says, I thought to play safe, I'd better try to get another court reporter. So I went over to the federal building in Boston. He says, I asked the clerk, who is the most experienced, most respected court reporter you have in the whole system here? And the clerk says, well, there's a woman, she's about 60 or so, and she's had 25 years in federal courts and some years in state courts and one thing and another. She was a lifetime court reporter, licensed to the hilt, everything that's needed. He says, I went to her, asked her how much she would charge to get down to Plymouth for an arraignment. And she says, well, I'd charge you $125 for the trip, and then so much a page for every page after that. And so he says, I took her on, and says, you're hired. So I brought her with me, and he says, when they've called my case, he says, they called the various ones, and finally they came to me and called my name. He says, I stood up and told the judge, this case is very important to me. And so I brought my own court reporter with me because I want an accurate transcript of everything that takes place from the very moment of arraignment on through, because as you realize, Your Honor, the appeal is on what takes place right here. And the judge got rather angry, and he says, you can't bring people in off the street to be court reporters in my court. If you don't like the tape recorder we have here, well, we have a licensed court reporter that will handle your affairs here, and if you want to pay him, we'll bring him in and have a transcript made in this court. And he says, well, I don't think I brought anyone off the street here. He says, will you get up and introduce yourself? So she introduced herself with all this experience, and finally the judge said, well, it wasn't really necessary for you to bring this woman down because you're entitled to a speedy trial, and we're so busy in this court, we're not going to be able to give you a speedy trial, so case is dismissed. He never even got a chance to use the material I gave him. But he says, that kind of shows you the importance of a court reporter that cannot be controlled by that judge. And that is a key thing that you must know. Have a court reporter from another court, one who is licensed, get everything you want, but don't have the one that shares the office with the judge. Because just the same as a tape recorder can be changed, a court reporter can be changed. Now, the point is that we are dealing in truth. They are dealing in falsehood. And I've discovered that the falsehood that they are trying to cover up is the fact that they're operating under international law. And they will not in any case admit they're moving under an admiralty jurisdiction. So I have great respect, and I've learned a lot from Bob Weingrod, from George Gordon, from Roger Elvick, from Bruce McCarthy, all these fellows. I've learned a great deal from them, and I don't want to play down their information one bit. But what they will show you is that licenses, especially your Social Security and some of these things, get you under international law. And so many of them will say, rescind your Social Security number, get rid of your driver's license, get rid of your marriage license, and so on, and go all the way down the line, and then get your status clean and declare you're a sovereign citizen, free man, and not subject to their jurisdiction. Well, all that is good for those who can easily do that. But you see, I'm living on Social Security. I paid into it for a number of years, and I gave good dollars, and I'm getting poor ones back, so I don't think I'm cheating anything, buddy. And on top of that, I do a lot of traveling, and I couldn't go into every county and fight a court case with no license plates on my car or things like that. So the one way to win any argument in a court is always to put yourself in the other fellow's point of view. You see your argument as clear as day, and you say, there is the way that I can beat him, and I know I'm right. But then you turn right around and put yourself and say, well, now I'm going to make myself, I'm the new actor, I'm the prosecuting attorney, and I'm going to get that rascal right there. And so I know all that rascal's going to throw at me, and how could I get the best of him? And then I try to figure from his point of view how I would get that Howard Freeman over there. And when I got it all figured out, and I figured out, well, Howard Freeman has got me in a corner, and I just can't get out of that, then I'm right to go to court. So, you see, you got to see every angle he's going to use, and then know that you can overcome it before you get in there. Then you don't have any problems. And the one thing that I know, in any court you go into, they're not going to admit they're operating under an admiralty jurisdiction. So if they're not going to admit that they're operating under an admiralty jurisdiction, what do you have to worry about the Social Security? Because if they say your Social Security puts you under an admiralty jurisdiction, well, and they're not allowed to admit that they're under an admiralty jurisdiction, why bother to get rid of your Social Security? You don't need to. You don't need to do any of these things. You don't need to get rid of your driver's license, because I'll tell you why. If the state has a contract with you in a driver's license, you've got all the elements of a contract. That is absolutely true. You gave up the right to drive, and you went and applied for the privilege to drive. There's the consideration. Now, you applied for the driver's license. That shows your agreement in the contract. Now you have the obligation to abide by the Motor Vehicle Code. Now that would be a perfect contract between you and the state, but they're not enforcing a contract between you and the state. And this is where some of these fellas don't see that. You see, if it were a contract between you and the state, it would be a civil offense. And all motor vehicle violations are criminal offenses. Something fishy here. A civil offense. Why don't they want to call it a civil offense? Well, the reason they don't call it a civil offense, because if the state were acting as a corporate body and they had a contract with you, the state could not use its own corporate courts to settle its own contract dispute. You see, the state would be a party to the action, and they couldn't use their own court. That would have to go into a federal court. So, in order to get jurisdiction in the state court, they have to call it a criminal action. But how are you going to make it a criminal action? There's only two criminal actions authorized for the courts. One is a criminal action under a common law jurisdiction, and that requires a cause of action. There has to be somebody who is damaged, and somebody has to file a complaint of damage. And in the common law, there has to be, as I say, a corpus delicti. And so they don't dare have a criminal action under the common law, because you could knock that case right out. The minute the judge says this is a criminal action under the common law, well, I say, well, I move, Your Honor, the case be dismissed. Oh, if he says that, well, maybe I better go through the step-by-step procedure here. And I will show you. This will work in any case whatever. And one of the things to back up what I'm saying here, I don't know how many of you have ever seen this, but this is called the private laws of, oh, wait a minute. Here's, this stuff is all twisted around. All right. Here's the Statutes at Large of the United States of America from March 1911 to March 1913. Edited and printed and published by the authority of Congress under the direction of the Secretary of States. This is volume 37. You can get this in any law library. Volume 37 of the Statutes at Large, and it's in two parts. Part 1, public acts and resolutions. Part 2, private acts and resolutions. This is part 2. And the first thing you see when you open it up is private laws of the United States of America passed by the 62nd Congress, 1911 to 1913. Now, many people don't know that they have our Congress passes private laws. I showed this to the IRS agents when they were talking with me. And then you turn over the next thing you read. Somebody's mixed this up. Looks like my wife had it. 16th Amendment to the Constitution, private law. Now, if that's private law, that means it's a contract. And you know it's a contract because if you know what law is, law does not compel anybody to do anything. At law, you're free to do anything you please, provided you do not infringe upon the life, the liberty, or the property of anyone else. That is any statute passed by Congress. If it's a public law statute, it's got to pass muster under that, or it's unconstitutional. And you cannot be compelled to perform in any way at law. At law, you're free to do anything you please. But now, here's where law works. I back out of my driveway, and I back into a car across the street, and I drive away. Well, the fellow there with his car, he gets my license plates, and he swears a complaint to an officer. The officer comes up and arrests me, brings me into court, and all that man has to do is to prove that it was my car that backed into the side of his car. And then law will give him full damages for all I did. Now that is where law begins and where law ends. It's when I injure somebody, then on a filed complaint, sworn complaint, and then the burden of proof is on the plaintiff who's made the complaint, and all he has to do is prove that I backed into him, and he gets damages. But, you see, there's no law that compels performance. Now, whenever you have a law, they call it law, that compels performance, you know there's a contract involved. That is equity. And I will show you, I got to watch my time. Boy, I could go 6 hours on this, and it gets more interesting as you go along. But you've got to know the difference between law and equity. And this was where America changed in 1938. I want to get that point over. I went one time, I was helping a fellow in a court case, and I had an open and shut case on constitutional law, and he was fighting the Internal Revenue Service. I had standing Supreme Court decisions that showed that this was an excise tax that they were demanding, that it wasn't a direct tax, that it was being collected as a direct tax. I thought the case was open and shut, and I had Supreme Court cases to back up everything I made, and the judge rejected all of the Supreme Court cases and ruled that the law required this man to file a tax return. Well, I went immediately, right after there, right in to see, and that was Judge Erbaum in Lincoln, and Spurgeon was the man, and I says, I was real indignant, and I says, how can you dare do this? I says, you're here to uphold the law, and don't you honor the Supreme Court of the United States? Here's standing decisions that contrary to what you did. And he says, well, I think you'll have to take notice, Mr. Freeman, that all your decisions were prior to 1938. He says, you bring me Supreme Court decisions after 38, and I'll honor them. And I says, well, these are standing decisions. They've never been overturned by the Supreme Court. How can you do that? And he says, well, all I would suggest you do is to read the Supreme Court cases since 1938. Things changed in 1938. Well, that was a clue to work on. And I discovered what happened in 1938. Roosevelt, as soon as he took office in 1933, borrowed money like a drunken sailor. And he didn't tax to the amount that he borrowed. So he had to borrow credit from the international banking establishments to make up the deficits. And in borrowing that credit, he set up an international contract in the name of all the people of the United States, in which he borrowed credit, and he agreed to repay that credit in gold coin. And by 1938, he had more credit extended to the people of the United States than they had gold coin to repay the debt. And so at that moment, America could have been declared a bankrupt nation. And but they didn't declare it. Now here's why it wasn't declared. The international bankers said, we're not through with America yet, we want to loan them a little more money. And so they are the ones that set up the international bar, which set up the American bar, which set up the state bars, and they set up the bar associations of every nation in the world to protect them in their skullduggery. And so in setting up the bar associations, of course the bar associations license the attorneys, and only licensed attorneys can be judges, so you see the control goes all the way back to there. Well, they didn't want to alarm the American people by saying you're bankrupts. So the bar associations obliged, and they said, well, we'll just say it this way. We'll say it, we're blending the procedures of law with the procedures of equity. Now the average person doesn't know what law is and doesn't know what equity is, so they won't know what we've done, and that was true. The average person didn't have any idea what happened to them. But that was a polite way of saying, you're bankrupts, you have no rights anymore, you're under a jurisdiction of compelled performance. Your Congress and your state legislatures no longer pass public law statutes, they pass public policy statutes in the interest of the nation's creditors. Now that's what happened in 1938. And all the federal judges take silent judicial notice that you're bankrupts. Now you all know what happens to you when you're bankrupt. You lose your rights at law. You can now be compelled to perform to the exact letter of your obligations. And in the case of a bankrupt, if you owe 3 different people money, the judge will say, well, you won't earn so much each week. You will give this man so much, that man so much, and that man so much, and you can have what's left. And failure to perform will be contempt of this court, and I'll put you in jail. So that's the way a bankrupt situation works. And equity, now see, any contract operates on that principle. You can be compelled to perform to the exact letter of the contract. And so that's held up under American law, it's held up under international law. All contracts are sacred, and you have no rights. If the contract calls for you to do something, well, I can give a quick example. I hate to, but maybe this example is good. A fellow one time wanted, in a given time while he was in Florida, he wanted his roof reshingled with cedar shingles. And he gave 3 weeks' time for the roof to be done. The price was set. The agreement was made here for a given consideration, and you will put cedar shingles on my roof. We both signed to it, it's agreement, and the obligation is to do it in the 3 weeks I'm in Florida and have the yard all cleaned up when I get back. So there's the agreement. Well, the carpenter says, I can do that in 1 week. I don't need 3 weeks. So he kills 2 weeks. Finally, he goes downtown, and he said, I got to get busy, get those shingles on that fellow's roof. Well, he goes downtown to the lumber company, and he says, give me some cedar shingles. The lumber company says, we don't have any cedar shingles. It'll take you 3 weeks to get them. Oh, what am I going to do? The building outfit says, don't worry. We got some new paper ones that are guaranteed to outlast cedar shingles. They're easier to put on, but they're just as expensive. So the fellow who's hiring you won't consider, oh, I'm down to 3 minutes. Oh, my golly. I tell you, meet me somewhere outside. I didn't see him. Ooh. Gee, boy. Well, I'll close that off. Anyway, the fellow puts the shingles on, and he crybabies in the court, claims, do I have any constitutional rights? The judge begs his gavel, you have no rights in this court. And so the judge reads the thing. He said, you agree to put cedar shingles on, and so on. The fellow says, yeah, but I couldn't get them, and these are just as good, and it would bankrupt me if I did it. Don't I have any rights? The judge says, you shut up, don't mention the Constitution in this court. You have an obligation to put cedar shingles on it, tear those off, put cedar shingles on it. That's where contracts are enforced, and that's the way they will be enforced, this international contract that we're under. But, I wanted to show you that what I wanted to tell you is how you can beat them on every time, because they'll never admit it's an admiralty jurisdiction they're operating under, and how you get them to admit it, to use the Sixth Amendment. Oh, boy. Maybe somewhere in the evening I'll get a chance to finish this off. It's just terrible. The most important part.
Mrs. Jones, I have a double sign. I'll give you 5 more minutes.
Okay, all right. Real quick, here's the way to do it. You go into court, you've got a court reporter that you can trust. So that everything you say is going to be in the record. Now, you start off this way. I don't care what the charge is, whether it's a failure to file income tax returns, OSHA, traffic offense. It doesn't matter. They're all operating under an admiralty jurisdiction. It's compelled performance on the basis of Roosevelt's international contract. You're all slaves. You have no rights. But they won't tell you that. So you go into court, and they read the charge. And they will always say, do you understand the charge? And always say, no. And the judge will be immediately, well, what's so difficult about this that you don't understand? Well, Your Honor, the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution gives me the authority to ask this court some questions regarding the nature and the cause of this action against me, and it gives this court the duty to answer the nature and the cause of this action. against me. And I have questions in regard to the nature and the cause of this action. The judge will say, well, what is it you want to know? Always ask him the easy question first. Is this a civil or a criminal action? And he'll say, it's a criminal action. Thank you, Your Honor. Let the record of this court show that this particular action against Howard Freeman is a criminal action. Now you got it set right in that record. Now, Your Honor, I have another question. There are two criminal jurisdictions authorized for this court. One is a criminal jurisdiction under a criminal action under a common law jurisdiction, and the other is a condition of international contract under the criminal aspects of an admiralty jurisdiction. Which jurisdiction are you going to try this court under? Now that's a question he doesn't want to answer, and that is a question he'll never answer. So once you've got that in the record that you asked it, he will always get angry. They'll do it every time. And he'll say, I'm not here to advise you on the law, Mr. Freeman. If you want to know these finer points of the law, I advise you to licensed attorney. And you say, well, Your Honor, I don't think you would be violating the law if you followed your duty under the Constitution and tell me the nature and the cause of this action. And you realize, Your Honor, that as I'm allowed to defend this in my own person, and the only way I can intelligently defend it is to know which jurisdiction I'm defending under, because the defenses under one jurisdiction are quite different than defenses under the other. And he'll get real angry again and say, I told you before, I'm not going to answer your questions. Get yourself a licensed attorney. Thank you, Your Honor. But let the record of this court show that the defendant has asked, under the authority of the Sixth Amendment, to know the nature and the cause of this criminal action against him, and this court has refused in its duty to state the nature and the cause of this action which is against him, and that this court intends to proceed in a criminal action against Howard Freeman under a secret jurisdiction known only to licensed attorneys. That knocks him right out. Now, sometimes they will recover, and they'll say, it's a statutory jurisdiction, Mr. Freeman. Thank you, Your Honor. Let the record of this court show that this court intends to conduct this criminal action against Howard Freeman under a statutory jurisdiction. Now you got that set. But, Your Honor, you must realize that I have never heard of a statutory jurisdiction for criminal actions. Can this court tell me where I can obtain the published rules of criminal procedure for statutory jurisdictions? There is no such thing. So if there isn't it, then it comes back, he's operating under a secret jurisdiction known only to licensed attorneys. Now, at that point, we've never had it. Every case will go out there. If you handle it right, at that point, the case will go out. But if they should come in and say it's an admiralty jurisdiction, I guess I'll have to do this at a later time, but I'll show you how you can beat them. And even if you've got Social Security, a driver's license, every kind of license, even if he says it's an admiralty jurisdiction, you can knock it right out. And that's what they know, it can be knocked out, because you put the truth, you'll knock the whole banking scam right at the bottom, right out from under it. And this is where it gets the most interesting part. And I guess I got it clipped, but maybe they'll squeeze in sometime.